Welcome back to Toffee Blues, your source for all things Everton. I'm Ollie Hayes, and today I'm bringing the extra time match review of Everton nil, Manchester City 2. Pretty disappointing afternoon at Goodison Park, which sees Manchester City take all 3 points. A scoreline that maybe flattered them a little bit, but we'll get onto that later in the video. We'll start the video with my starting 11 thoughts going into the game. And listen, hindsight's a wonderful thing. The question was maybe mainly that was on everyone's lips ahead of the game was, would it be Armando Broja? Would it be Beto? David Moyes went with Armando Broja from the start. Those that watched my starting 11 prediction for David Moyes will know that I actually put Beto to start from the beginning against Manchester City, purely because I do just think we looked a lot more dangerous against Nottingham Forest with Beto on the pitch. So Beto, for me, creates a little bit more. He's a little bit more of a handful for defenders. So maybe David Moyes was getting a little bit more of a look of Armando Broja ahead of a potential decision that has to be made about his future. But obviously, as I said before, hindsight's a wonderful thing because he didn't have a fantastic game. But we'll get onto that later in the video. We'll start as well with the first half, and it was an even start for both teams. Manchester City seemed happy to have the ball. As expected, as per usual, they seemed to be happy to have the ball at Goodison Park, whilst we were happy to sort of let them have it and sit back and sort of go into our usual counter-attacking shape that we've seen so many times under David Moyes, especially against teams like in the Big Six, for example. We played a similar kind of style against Arsenal, against Mikel Arteta. So I wasn't surprised to see the start that we put in, seeing us sort of regress into that defensive shape. But there was a few chances here and there in that first half. Manchester City having the bulk of them. A great block by Jake O'Brien on the line from a Kevin De Bruyne shot. Apart from that, there was a few other chances here and there. Jordan Pickford making a good save from Matheus Nunes, but we actually probably had the best chance of that first half, with a deep ball by James Garner into the box and James Tarkowski getting up highest to meet the header, and he was so unlucky to see his effort bounce off the post. Ortega was completely beaten, and maybe unsurprisingly, we actually had the best chances of that first half. But as I said before, it was relatively uneventful, relatively even. Both sides playing okay, just couldn't really find that cutting edge. But I'd say going into half time, 0-0 was probably a fair representation of the game. As I said before, just that lack of cutting edge between both teams that was, really keeping the score at 0-0. So, at half time, I'm thinking we're definitely in the game here. We can massively go into the second half with the wind in our sails and try and put in a decent performance to overcome Manchester City. There was a weird sort of air of confidence in the fans on Saturday, something that we've not seen against the Manchester City side for so long. Me personally, every single time Pep's Manchester City comes to Goodison, you're either going to have a performance where you're going to get wiped the floor with, or you're going to get beat pretty comprehensively. So, but Saturday felt a little bit different. There was a little bit of an air of confidence. I don't think Manchester City were the team that they once were, and they're not really a team to be feared anymore. So, as I said, at half time, 0-0 was a fair representation. I think we were good value for money, going into that second half, and could we just find that little bit more cutting edge? But second half began, and there was a pretty big turning point at the start of that second half on 52 minutes. James Tarkowski pulling up injured, with what looks like a suspected hamstring injury. We've not actually got the full details on that yet, so fingers crossed that's nothing too serious. But I was saying to the people I was sat around, that's the first time that James Tarkowski's gone down injured in so long. He's not a player that goes down injured very easily. I think he was into for triple figures in terms of consecutive appearances for Everton in the Premier League. So it shows you how available he's been in the last few seasons. But it meant that Michael Keane came on in his place. Michael Keane is just way off it, isn't he? He's so poor. He looks completely out of match sharpness. The first thing, I think we've got to address the substitution, the decision itself to leave Jake O'Brien at right back and bring Michael Keane on when you had Ashley Young, Nathan Patterson, and Seamus Coleman all sat on the bench who are natural fullbacks. My first initial thought would be to put Jake O'Brien at centre half next to Jared Branthwaite to shore it up a little bit, and then bring on the likes of maybe an Ashley Young. I know it was probably a little bit too early in the game for Ashley Young, considering his age and his speed against the likes of Savino or the other City wingers, for example, the amount of speed they've got. Doku coming on later on, for example. So maybe it was a little bit too young, a little bit too early for Ashley Young in the game. But Nathan Patterson, I thought he had a very good performance against Arsenal at left back. So why not throw him on and sort of shore up the centre of defence with Jake O'Brien? Listen, we've not seen Jake O'Brien in centre of defence yet, and he might have just been as bad as Michael Keane, but at least we kind of know what to expect with Michael Keane, and he looked very nervy very early on. It was shown pretty much within 3 or 4 minutes of Michael Keane entering the pitch, he got booked for a challenge on Omar Marmoush. I think that was 4 minutes after his introduction to the game. And then another flashpoint in the second half was Michael Keane. He sort of got lent on by Marmoush and headed it straight into the path of him. And but for a good intervention by Jordan Pickford and Jake O'Brien on the line, we would have gone 1-0 down there. But that kind of set the tone for the second half. As I said before, on 52 minutes, that's sort of the turning point of that second half. And City ramped up the pressure as expected. I said all along that City, were trying to find their groove, and the likes of James Tarkowski and Jared Branthwaite were disrupting that, but City ramped up the pressure, ramped up their style, and Nico O'Reilly's tap-in was ultimately the difference between the two teams. Vitaly Mikalenko getting beaten, I think I saw a few question marks over him for the goal. He's been beaten by a tricky midfielder who's just got a little bit of an extra yard of pace on him. A great cross by Matheus Nunes into Nico O'Reilly, who tapped in. We had no real response from that one. City were able to control the game from there, and that sort of wrapped up the second half in terms of our chance creation. The second goal was a bit of a sickener for me. Beto was very unlucky to see the ball ricochet off him straight into the path of Jeremy Doku, sort of a long looping ball across the pitch, which found Jeremy Doku, who put the ball into the box, found Gundogan, who laid it off for Kovacic in sort of a slide tackle finish. It looked like it got away from him initially, but as I said before, a little bit of a sickener because I thought we were a really good value for a large part of that game, for large spells of that game. But yeah, as I said before, the game ended 2-0 to Manchester City. Maybe a little bit harsh on Everton. No, I don't think we were creating too many chances in that second half to be able to come away with 3 points, but I think we definitely held on and held in there against a very, very top side, a very top attack for large spells of that game. And obviously, ultimately, a pointless afternoon against Manchester City as they ran out winners. But that sort of wraps up the match review. I'll just go on to my standout performers now. And for me, I've mentioned him briefly already in this video. It has to be Vitaly Mikalenko. He was my man of the match. I thought he was absolutely fantastic in defence. Maybe a little bit harsh to see him on the wrong end of the result, certainly on the wrong end of a clean sheet, because I thought he massively deserved it with his defensive play. A lot of people have criticised Vitaly Mikalenko in recent months, and me myself, I've been a little bit critical of him at times where he might have needed a little bit of a spell out the team just to collect his thoughts and go again. But I thought on Saturday he had a very, very good game. On 70 minutes, that cruncher of a tackle on Bernardo Silva, and then him picking up the ball, being really progressive and spraying a crossfield ball to Abdoulaye Doucouré just showed, it culminated that performance for me because I thought he was absolutely fantastic. He's massively turned a corner under David Moyes. You can say that about a lot of players, but for me, this second half of the season, alongside Jake O'Brien, Vitaly Mikalenko has definitely been the most improved player in that side. But also away from Vitaly Mikalenko, I thought Jordan Pickford had a good game as well. Nothing he could really do for either goal. Made some crucial saves at times, as I mentioned before, the one from Omar Marmoush, but the one in the first half from Matheus Nunes as well. Pickford just making crucial saves when it matters and keeping the game at 0-0 for as long as he could. But apart from that, it was pretty lackluster going forward. There wasn't a lot of creation. Obviously, Dwight McNeil coming on late on didn't have enough time to get into the game or create anything. But it kind of rounded off a pretty disappointing afternoon in Everton standards. But obviously, it leads us on to a trip to Stamford Bridge, where it was around this time last year that we were on the receiving end of a 6-0 drubbing at the hands of the likes of Cole Palmer and Nicholas Jackson. So fingers crossed we can right the wrongs from that one. But that is all for my extra time match review of Manchester City 2, Everton 0. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about if there was any other standout performers that I might have missed. But apart from that, thanks for watching. And make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and I'll speak to you soon.